Well, that raises some absolutely critical questions of governance. If we're going to move forward with climate engineering, we need to start thinking about some essential questions, and that's where my legal research is aimed. One obvious question: who chooses the methods? You know, we don't necessarily want 10 different people all trying to cool the atmosphere by 2 degrees through their own individual methods. We might find that the cooling gets a little more than anticipated. So who chooses the methods? Who regulates their use? We don't know that. Who bears the cost? Who pays for the damage if there is damage, unanticipated damage? And maybe the most fundamental question of all: who controls the thermostat? If we discover that we can select our temperature, who gets to pick? We need to begin thinking about these questions, in my opinion, very, very seriously, and we need to develop answers quickly, because the bandwagon is starting to roll. Or, you know, if you'll forgive me, Phaeton's chariot is beginning its ascent. What does international law have to say about this at the present day? Different techniques involve different parts of the environment, and so there are various international laws that might apply, different laws for ocean fertilization than to shooting things in the atmosphere. I want to speak more generally about what international law generally says about climate engineering or geoengineering. And the answer is not really a heck of a lot. There are some international agreements that are marginally relevant. After the United States tried to alter the climate in Vietnam during the Vietnam War to cause lots of rain over the Ho Chi Minh Trail and render it unusable, the international community entered into a convention on the prohibition of military or hostile use of environmental modification techniques. That convention might have some principles applicable to this situation, except that it's very carefully written, so it only applies to hostile use of environmental modification, and these would not be hostile uses within any meaning of the term in that convention. In 1980, the UN Environmental Program adopted some environmental modification guidelines in 1980. But those guidelines have sat for the last 30 years, basically ignored and not developed. And in any event, they are styled as recommendations only, and they don't do much more than repeat certain basic principles of customary international law that would be applicable in any event, so they don't help. The World Meteorological Organization just updated this summer its statement on and guidelines on weather modification. So I went and I read that, and they say not one word about the governance issue. It's all focused on technical and research issues. So none of these international rules that or documents that are marginally related actually address the governance issues or even establish a framework in which to raise the issues of governance in this area. As I said, for particular techniques, there are treaty regimes that might be applicable. The UN Convention on the Law of the Sea will have something to say about ocean fertilization. The Treaty on Long-Range Transboundary Air Pollution has some relevance to the possibility of putting sulfate aerosols into the atmosphere. But the legal scholars who've researched these things have pretty much reached the conclusion that even these potential sources of regulatory rules don't provide any real governance to these activities. At best, they impose a requirement that no harm be done, but without any particular ability to enforce that requirement or monitor the activities. On the other hand, there are some basic principles of international environmental law that set fundamental parameters that are likely to shape any future governance system. So I want to say a little bit about those principles because I think they'll guide the international community as it moves forward. There are certain basic duties in international environmental law that are well respected and widely adhered to. One is the duty to notify, consult, and cooperate, for a country to notify and consult and cooperate with other countries if it's engaged in or authorizing activities that could have a significant transboundary impact. And climate engineering would certainly fall within the category of activities that could have a significant transboundary impact. Another obligation, maybe a little less accepted as truly obligatory, is the obligation to assess the environmental impact of activities you engage in. Most countries have domestic laws requiring environmental impact assessment, but there are a lot of fights domestically about when they apply and how much assessment is required. The international community similarly requires environmental assessment, but the treaty the treaties that require this aren't universal, and customary law arguably requires it, but perhaps not with the strength one would hope. But nonetheless, that's a principle that is likely to impact thinking about regulating climate engineering. That climate engineering activity should be subject to some form of environmental assessment before it occurs rather than after it occurs. There's an obligation to share information. And in the climate area, that's a pretty strong obligation because of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. And there is an obligation to avoid significant transboundary harm, about which I will speak more later. An obligation that is frequently invoked, but in the environmental arena, not so frequently applied. One sometimes hears non-governmental organizations that are opposed to geoengineering argue that it violates principles of international law. They rely heavily on the notion that transboundary harm should be avoided and on the precautionary principle. I have quite a different view of the situation. I think general international environmental law is not hostile to geoengineering in principle. Indeed, I think there are some arguments to be made that it's a solution that international environmental law would encourage us to pursue. And I just want to lay that case out briefly because I think it's important in understanding how the international community might respond to this. In international environmental law, like it or not, people come first, not nature. It's about people. It is not about nature. That was clear in 1972 in the Stockholm Declaration, which says man, read people, has the fundamental right to adequate conditions of life in an environment of equality that permits a life of dignity and well-being. And he bears a solemn responsibility to protect and improve the environment. It's not about the environment for the environment's sake. It's about the environment for human sake. And that's an important theme throughout international environmental law. The Rio Declaration used different language, but the principle of sustainable development is the same principle. Yes, environmental protection is good, but it has to be balanced against our right to develop and use the environment for human purposes, and we combine those through the concept of sustainable development. The Stockholm Declaration went even further on this, along these lines, when it talked about technology. Stockholm Principle 18 said that on the role of science and technology, said that they must be applied to the identification, avoidance, and control of environmental risks and the solution of environmental problems. And that is a line that a geoengineer must love, that you need to use technology to control these risks and avoid these problems. Finally, there's the precautionary principle. And this is where people who are concerned about geoengineering and want to argue that international law prohibits it tend to hang their hat, the precautionary principle. The precautionary principle says when risks are too high, caution is appropriate. And the fact that you're not sure about the outcome of the risk isn't a reason for failing to take action. Usually that's used as an argument for banning chemicals. Even though you don't know how bad they really are, you should ban them because they might cause harm. And that's how people think of it. So the Swedish Society for the Conservation of Nature, which is the NGO, one of the NGOs that is strongest against geoengineering, has said that geoengineering flies in the face of precaution. Techniques that alter the composition of the atmosphere or the chemistry of the oceans are likely to have unintended consequences, and therefore pursuing those techniques would violate the precautionary principle. I don't, really think that's an entirely accurate reading of the principle. So I've put the principle on the board here. Starts out, well, where there are threats of serious or irreversible damage, lack of full scientific certainty shall not be used as a reason for postponing cost-effective measures to prevent environmental degradation. One could read that as an argument for climate engineering as easily as one can read it as an argument against. The climate crisis is presenting us with threats of serious or irreversible damage. We might not know all we would like to know about climate engineering, but we do know it's cheap and it could help us stop this crisis. And so the precautionary principle would say, go ahead. It's a matter of how much you weigh the risks of the climate change against the risks of climate engineering.